Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. It's game 12 of the World Championship match in Kazakhstan, Astana. Jan Nepomniachtchi is leading 6 points versus 5 for Ding. 3 more games to go, and in game 12 today, it's Ding playing with the white pieces, and he opens the game with 1d4. Knight f6, knight f3, d5. And here, interesting moment, as Ding plays the move e3. And that's very interesting, because in game 6 of the match, he opted for the move bishop f4. It's a more common way of developing, bringing the dark squared bishop out first before playing the move e3. And we have the London system, and that brought Ding a very important victory with the white pieces. But obviously, the surprise factor, it's something very relevant at the highest level. And I guess that the move e3 may have come as a surprise to Nepo. c5 played, we have the Collie system on the board. White's bishop is inside the pawn chain. And now another remarkable twist. As White plays here the move knight bd2. This looks pretty odd, because this bishop is not very happy. But it's quite an interesting way of avoiding a theoretical battle, and although there are still quite a number of interesting games, it usually leads to fresh type of positions, just a more or less equal middle game we will get to see. And one of the ideas is that White probably would like to take on c5, followed by knight b3, trying to stick to the pawn on c5. So therefore, c takes d4 is on the board, and now after e takes d4, we have this famous Carlsbad structure with an extra pawn for black in the center, but White is ready to go c3 and will possibly try to use the half-open e-file very soon. But Nepo was definitely up to the task, and here played the move queen c7, which is a remarkable move, but it's the top choice of the engine, so apparently this didn't come as a huge surprise to him. But queen c7 itself, it looks a bit weird. Why would you play a queen move rather than developing one of your minor pieces? White goes c3, but especially his next move, bishop d7, is quite a remarkable decision, because the bishop itself, it's not doing great on d7. Black is normally going to play e6, and then you would rather have your bishop somewhere out on f5 or g4. But, well, Nepo plays bishop d7, and after bishop d3, he got quite a reasonable position. But interestingly, both players underestimated the strength of this move, knight e5. And I think that's a very important resource for White. So that after knight c6, you can bring the other knight to f3. And this is a far more active approach for White than what we will get to see in the game. The knights are excellently placed. The bishop on c1 can easily be brought into play, for instance to f4. The other bishop comes to d3. And White definitely has a pleasant advantage here. But as I said, bishop d3 was played. Knight c6. And White castles. And now we still really didn't get to see the main point of the move bishop d7. And objectively, it was not such a great move. But before playing the move e6, Nepo decides, well, let's get the bishop out first to g4. And I think the main reason why he is playing this move right now is only that White has castled. So ideas to go after the bishop, let's say if you go h3, bishop h5 and then g4, would only be a weakening move. Whereas if the king would have still been in the center, it's not such a weakening idea. White went rook e1. Both players are continuing with their development. And now the big difference, if you purely look at the white knights, the knight goes now back to f1. Opening up the path for the bishop, so that after bishop d6, there is bishop g5. And I believe interesting moment. Deciding difficult decision here to make for black, what to do with the king, because the king could still go either side, right? Could go to the queen side, which is a very double-edged decision. Maybe white will look for ideas to play for an attack on that wing. But in the game, Nepo castles king side. And it's a very interesting idea because basically you do allow white to capture on f6, which was played in the game. But Nepo had assessed pretty well that if he does get a bit of time and get a chance to go king h8, rook g8, it may actually be the case that white's king is more vulnerable than black's. Very interesting decision. Black has the bishop pair, control over the dark squares. The bishop can always come over to help on f4. Knight g3 played. So white's idea is to prepare h3, questioning the bishop, and after bishop takes, queen takes, well, the queen would be nicely placed on f3. f5 on the board to close the diagonal of the light squared bishop, hitting the pawn on h7. h3. And black is now forced to trade off its light squared bishop. So bishop takes and queen takes. Interesting moment because black has to decide how to organize its king side. So the most natural move here would be to play king h8, followed by rook g8, rook g7, get the other rook over, and these double pawns, they are not too vulnerable as it looks like. But probably Nepo didn't like king h8 because of knight takes f5. And after e takes f5, queen takes f5, there are some threats, mating threat on h7. And after f6, well, the other rook comes into e6. And there's quite a bit of play here. White has 2 pawns for the piece, but black's king is quite exposed. But objectively speaking, there are still no problems if you go here for the move rook d8, overprotecting the bishop with the point that you can take on f6, and after swapping the rooks, there is still queen g7 as the rook protects the bishop. There's no time to take it. White has 3 pawns for the piece, which is reasonable compensation, but well, this didn't happen. This didn't happen at all, so let's see what Nepo's idea was. He went for the move knight e7. He wanted to play it safe, to avoid all these sort of potential sacrifices on f5. But now the knight comes in to h5. And you can see that the pawn on g7 is definitely missed. Imagine a white queen would be on h6. There are all sorts of mating threats with a queen coming to g7 or a knight coming into f6. So therefore black quickly goes for the move king h8, intending to get the rook over. But now things are heating up. g4 played, putting pressure on the pawn on f5, with the main point being that after fg4, it's queen to f6 with check, and it's leading to checkmate on the next move. Therefore, black can never really take the pawn. Nepo played here rook g8, pinning the pawn on g4, and white goes king h1. And it looks as if white's king is safe, and there's quite a bit of pressure against the pawn on f5. Still, black can never take on g4 because of queen f6 with a mating idea. But now, key defensive idea for black, it's the move knight to g6, which was played by Nepo. Excellent decision. The pawn on f5 is no longer sufficiently defended, but the main idea of black here is that g takes f5 can be met by knight to h4, attacking the queen. And the queen doesn't have a great square to go to. In fact, if the queen would come back to e2, there is a rook g2, threatening to give a check on h2, followed by rook g8. All of a sudden, it's black who's going to take over the attack. This is incredibly dangerous and should definitely be avoided by white. Still, there are other ways of playing. For instance, instead of queen e2, maybe queen e3 is a better idea, not fearing the move knight g2, which is a fork on the queen and rook, because that allows queen h6. Excellent idea. Threatening mate with queen f6. Look at that knight on h5 covering the g7 square. Things are really unpleasant now for black. However, after queen e3, black's key resource is the move e takes f5. The pawn is defended by the knight. The knight is excellently placed. And in case of queen h6, you always have rook g6. Back to the game. It seems that with knight g6, black has everything under control as white is not able to take on f5. The most obvious move here for white would be to get the other rooks involved. So rook g1 is the ideal move. However, it does allow bishop h2. And then, once again, rook g2 attacking the bishop runs into this move knight h4. And this time it's a fork. White is going to lose material. So after bishop h2, there's only rook g2 e1 back, for instance. And then at least black can settle for a repetition of moves, which would be great for black, right? Nepo is in the lead. He would love to draw his games with the black pieces. Of course, Nepo wanted that, but Ding had different ideas. He decided to keep the tension on the board. Played here, remarkable move, bishop c2, which was not something the engines really liked. But you can imagine that in certain cases, the queen and bishop, they can form a battery on the b1, h7 diagonal. But it's really far away and unlikely to happen anytime soon. Knight h4 played anyway, so the knight on h4 is doing an excellent job, kicking the queen away. Queen e3 with the idea to come over to h6, with ideas of coming into to f6, for instance. Rook g6, therefore, played. And still, g takes f5 is never really an option because of rook g2, and it's black who's going to take over with the two rooks and the support of the other pieces as well. Only now, rook g1 played. Good idea when white also is planning to take on f5 if possible. And it's a really difficult position to understand. I mean, objectively, black is in good shape, but it's very tricky with both kings being vulnerable, both knights on the h-file. They also make a weird impression. Are they really useful attacking pieces, or may they even been stranded at the side of the board? But Nepo goes f4, attacking the queen, taking away the pressure from the pawn on f5. And after queen d3, he decides that the diagonal is closed. There's nothing to do for the queen. The queen comes over to e7. And after rook a e1, queen g5. I like this plan. I like that black's pieces are working well together. All the potential threats have been covered. And well, if black were allowed to play a number of more moves, let's say rook a g8, maybe rook g6 could be considered, sorry, rook h6 could be considered, vacating the g6 square for the knight, so the knight could come back. Who knows, maybe the queen comes into h4. There's a lot of shuffling going on the king side. And frankly, I don't see an effective plan here for white. And I think also Ding realized that very well. He needed to do something. And he decided to open up the board on the other side by playing the move c4, which is a really remarkable decision, in fact, because it does weaken the pawn structure. But with the opening of this move, white hopes to generate some counterplay. D takes c4 was played instantly. And now you cannot really recapture that pawn because it runs into knight f3, attacking both rooks, and also the queen will come into h4 very soon. This is pretty bad, in fact, for white. But instead, queen c3 was played. So the pawn remains under threat, and white is basically hinting at ideas based on the move d5, giving a check, opening up the diagonal, and trying to open the center at the same time. But Nepo calculated pretty well at this stage. Played here the move b5. He wants to stick to this pawn, supporting it. And the pawn is a pawn. White goes a4. And I believe that the vast majority of amateur players would just think, well, white's not going to do anything there. Let's play a6. Hold the position together. It's still a pawn. Would have been a perfectly playable choice. But instead, Nepo went for the move b4. Very interesting move. Attacking the queen. White takes the pawn on c4. And now, really bizarre, the next move was played only within 27 seconds. Wasn't it possible to think a little bit longer, Mr. Nepo? Well, he played here the move rook a g8, which proves to be a serious mistake. What should black have done? The move knight f3 is on the cards. It's a really, really strong move. But I guess that that Nepo didn't like the move knight f3 because of queen c6 with a multiple attack on all these pieces. Everything is unprotected. But if you calculate a bit deeper, there is knight takes e1. Black captures the rook. White captures the rook with check on a8. There is a rook g8. So now both the queen and the bishop are under threat. And if you would play queen e4, threatening mate yourself with a battery of queen and bishop and attacking the knight, there is knight takes c2. Queen takes c2. Looks as if play has become a bit calmer now. All these pieces have been exchanged. But there is queen h4. Threatening to give mate by taking on h3. Which is a big move. And if you play queen d3 to protect this pawn, well, there is this move f5. And all of a sudden, white's position is gonna collapse. This could have been played in the game. And probably this would have been game, set and match. Imagine black would win this game. He's 2 points up with only 2 more games to play. Here the pawn on g4 can no longer be halted. Also, the knight on h5 is really, really badly placed and white's king is more vulnerable than black's. So here this was a critical moment and definitely Nepo should have spent more time. Instead he played rook a g8, believing that after bishop takes g6 there is h takes g6 and the knight is trapped. The knight cannot go anywhere and black will get 2 minor pieces for the rook after capturing next. But the line continues. It's queen c6 attacking the bishop. If g takes h5, queen takes d6, and then knight f3. It's a knight fork, so instead of being exchanged down, material balance will be restored. But objectively, white can never be better in such position. And Ding didn't want it. He instead, after rook a g8, didn't take the exchange on g6, but played the move queen c6 straight away, attacking the bishop. And another big moment as Nepo, also on his next move, he didn't spend too much time. He dropped back to a safe square, b8, where it's protected by the rook. There are no threats against this bishop, but it's not the best move. And instead, black should have gone for its own chances as well. And the big blow, difficult to find, because also the rook on g6 is still hanging. But it's the move knight f5. Really amazing resource. The knight protects the bishop. The bishop on c2 can no longer take the rook. And the simple idea is that after g takes f5, there is queen takes h5 with a huge mating threat on h3. If you take the rook, it's mate. So the rook cannot be taken. But also, if you do protect the pawn on h3, there's queen takes h3, bang! King takes, a rook h6 with checkmate, thanks to these 2 rooks. Other moves, for instance, like rook takes g6, also doesn't offer salvation. There is queen takes h3, king g1, h takes g6. If the bishop is taken, it's g takes f5 with a beautiful mate of queen and rook. And if you try to avoid the opening of the g-file with f takes g6, the bishop covers the g6 pawn, well, there is f3 with a mating threat on g2, as well as also there's ideas with bishop h2 or queen h2. So this is game over. Was a second missed opportunity for Nepo. Let's see what happened after bishop b8, which was played. And here in return, another big mistake by Ding. He could have taken on g6 now. Very important idea. After h takes g6, the knight is trapped, but there is this key move d5. Not minding the knight on h5 can be taken. And you should understand the idea of opening the position is trying to get the knight back into the game. After e takes d5, there is knight f6 and the queen protects the knight. And also, if you take with the queen on d5, the queens will come off the board and the knight can safely jump to f6. But the critical line is, of course, g takes h5. And now after d takes e6, well, black has 2 minor pieces for the rook, but his king gets open and white's rooks are superior. White is threatening to take on f7, which is crushing. fe6 runs into g takes h5, attacking the queen, forcing black to take. And now after rook takes g8, king takes g8, it's queen takes e6, and it's game over. The black minor pieces are not working together. After king h7, it's queen e7, king g8, for instance, and now you force the exchange of queens. And at the end of the line, the bishop on b8 is still hanging. Queen b7 played instead. So the idea is to attack the pawn on f7. And, well, also the rook, of course, is still hanging. But still, knight f5, this idea could still have been considered. It was actually a nice idea with g takes f5 running into queen takes h5 with, again, that mating threat. But Nepo didn't consider it at all, probably. Played rook h6, making sure the rook is safe. And after queen takes f7, the rook is doing pretty well, covering the mating threat on h7. And now you have knight f3 and black wins material. Therefore, knight f3 is a threat when the queen is no longer covering that square. So therefore, first, bishop e4. The bishop covers the light squares and tries to dominate that knight on h4. And still, it's a very tricky position, but for black it's also really hard to break through and get access to the white king. But I feel that around this point, Nepo lost the control over the position. Probably he should have gone for a move like f3, looking for counterplay, so that after white captures the pawn on f7, there is knight to g2, and you're trying to get the knight involved, try to generate some play against the king. Still very complex, and getting lower on time difficult to find. But rook f8, it's definitely a step into the wrong direction. You're protecting the pawn, but white gets the opportunity to take the pawn on b4 with a gain of time, as the queen hits the rook on f8. Queen to d8, queen went back, but the attack is also over. And white, at the moment, is even a pawn down. Ding tried to consolidate its position now with queen c3. Queen is helping in defense, but most importantly is looking at the black king. Knight went back to g6. Trying to consolidate, and taking on g6 is never really attractive because that knight on h5 still remains out of play. Ding decided to drop back, which is perhaps not the most ambitious move. He may have also considered a move like d5 to try to open the center and generate some play on the diagonal, or maybe at some point use the d file for the rook. But bishop g2, with the idea that at some point the rook may also be useful on the e file, and then the bishop doesn't obstruct the rook. Queen h4 played. There were other possibilities like coming back to the center with the bishop. Looks pretty playable for black still. But with queen h4, the pawn on f2 is under threat. Rook e2 played, and now an insane moment. Absolutely insane. And here Nepo got caught by the tension. He just collapsed. Absolutely remarkable move he played now. There are still a lot of moves. Queen g5, bishop d6. Basically, all of these solid moves are possible. Just so that you, after d5, you're able to play e5. That's mainly the main point. But instead, he played f5. And I think he was dreaming of deciding the game in a mating attack himself. Like, he wanted to play this move, f takes g4, and the pawn on h3 is pinned. And it could be just game over, absolutely. But he miscalculated. There is rook takes e6. And I'm not sure what he missed exactly. But in case of f takes g4, there is d5 check, discovered check by the queen. If you go king g8, it's mate on g7. So you have to interfere on e5, but there's rook takes e5. And it's game over. There's a mating attack. If knight takes e5, queen takes e5. Once again, king g8, it's mate on g7, thanks to that knight on h5. If you play rook h to f6, well, you can take on f6 anytime and you're piece up. But well, the rook is pinned. Black cannot do anything, so you could even play d6 first and think about what you would like to do next. Case of f3, there's bishop f1. The king side is perfectly well defended here. Definitely, I'm not sure what Nepo missed, but he must have overlooked a very simple tactic. After rook takes e6, he decided to take on h5, but that was desperate. That can never have been the idea of the move f5. After g takes h5, queen takes h5, white does an exchange up, and after d5 check, king g8, d6, it's absolutely game over. There's nothing black can do. There are no threats against the king. Maybe the bishop will come to d5 at some point, threatening a discovered check with a rook. The queen protects the pawn on h3, so white's king is absolutely safe. Nepo resigned. It's 6-6. What an incredible turnaround in the match. It's for the third time in the match that Ding managed to come back from a 1-point deficit. And well, it's just really interesting to see what is gonna happen in the next 2 games. Because one thing is clear, we will get to see 14 classical games. It's 6-6 now, 2 more classical games. Both players have one time the white pieces. And then, in case of a tie, we will go to a tie break with a rapid format. But we have seen so many decisive games in the match already. I don't think we are going to tie breaks, but we will see. Maybe we get 2 decisive games and then go to the tie breaks anyway. It's going to be very spectacular, and I'll hope you'll be back tomorrow to see game 13, and the day after, on Friday, we will have game 14 of the match. Let's see how the match evolves.